Hello and welcome to True Crime Hub. Today we'll be discussing the case of Junko Furuta. This is the first case on the True Crime Hub page that will be taking us outside of the UK. When I first heard about this case, I was taken aback by the sheer brutality and senselessness of it, and so I felt like it was an interesting case to cover. Before we get started, I'd just like to ask you to subscribe to the channel, as it really does help me out. So, as mentioned, this case takes place in Japan, which is famous for natural sights like cherry blossom and Mount Fuji. But beyond this, it's also a hub for cutting-edge technology like Japanese cars and bullet trains, wacky inventions like karaoke and vending machines. Regardless of what springs to mind when you think of Japan, it's a unique and exciting place. I definitely have it on my bucket list of places to visit. Today's case takes place in 1988, where at the time in Japan it was moving away from agriculture and manufacturing and moving towards technology and innovation. That being said, the subject of our case today was a typical teenage girl. Junko Furuta was a 17-year-old schoolgirl living, studying and working in Masato, Japan. She was born in 1971 and had an elder and younger brother. She attended Yashio Minami High School and worked part-time at a plastic moulding factory after her school day had finished. She did this to save up money for a graduation trip she had planned. Junko had also accepted a job at an electronics retailer where she had planned on working after her graduation. Sadly, she would never come to see the day. In her high school, Junko was well liked and popular. She was surrounded by loads of friends and was considered to be a popular girl in her school. Not only was she pretty, but also ambitious. She had dreams of becoming a famous singer and loved to entertain. But beyond that, she was hardworking and driven. Her days were longer than most teenagers, given that she was working as well as studying. In November of 1988, Junko was riding her bike en route home after completing a shift at the moulding factories in which she worked. Suddenly, Junko was pushed off her bike by a dark figure who had quickly scurried away. Junko had fallen off her bike when pushed, and a passerby approached her to help her back on her feet. He was a young man named Hiroshi Miyano, not far off in age from her, and he seemed polite and genuinely concerned, so she graciously accepted his offer to walk her home. Along the walk home, the young man, Hiroshi, convinced Junko to take a detour with him, which led to a disused warehouse, and it was here that Junko realised that she was in danger. This kind man who had offered to walk her home had done so in order to be in a secluded place alone with Junko. His demeanour changed and he became aggressive and forceful with Junko. What Junko didn't know was that her being knocked off her bike earlier had all been planned by Hiroshi Miyano and his friend Nobarahu Minato. They had been loitering around the area looking for women to rob and rape, and thus their paths had crossed with Junko. The now less friendly stranger had led Junko to an empty warehouse where he raped her for the first time. Once it was over, Junko for a brief moment had thought her traumatic ordeal was over. However, her perpetrator had other plans. He forced Junko to go with him to a nearby low-budget hotel where he raped her again. Following a few short phone calls made by her captor, 3 other similarly aged young men had joined them. These were Nobarahu Minato, Yasushi Watanabe, and Joe Ogara. Once the other men arrived, they helped to transport the now distressed Junko to a house belonging to the family of Hiroshi. It was here that Junko was subjected to a sexual assault by the entire gang. The 4 men completely disregarded Junko as a person and held her hostage in the house. This wasn't the first time that the group had done this though. They had previously kidnapped and gang raped another girl and released her hours after her ordeal. The crime would go on unreported for some time as the girl was afraid of the group's connection to the Yakuza. It was here that Junko was threatened by the wrath of the Yakuza. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. For those unaware, the Yakuza is the Japanese mafia who are well connected and dangerous. While researching this case and the Yakuza, one interesting fact that I learnt about the Japanese mafia is that the pinky finger can be amputated as a means of punishment or to show sincere apology, and there have been instances where members of the Yakuza have cut their own finger off and offered it as a sacrifice. So, going back to the events that were unfolding, Junko was tied up and held captive, but she was also threatened that if she had attempted to leave, the Yakuza would kill her entire family. However, unbeknown to Junko or her captors, her family had grown increasingly worried since 2 days had passed without Junko returning home, and thus the family filed a missing persons report with the local police. When this information got back to her captors, they forced Junko to make a phone call to her family. They had located her family's address and phone number in Junko's belonging and forced her to call her parents and explain that she was safe and was staying with a friend and would return home when she was ready. Tragically, that would never happen, and that was the last time that the family heard from Junko. This phone call meant that the search for Junko was called off, and everyone in her life had believed that she was willingly staying with a friend. Junko's fate had been sealed, and now she was at the hands of her captors, who had shown her no mercy, and this was not likely to change. Junko was subjected to daily rapes by numerous people. You see, the men being part of the Yakuza meant that they were well connected, and this had led to over 100 men abusing Junko in this way, at times for money and other times not. It's thought that she was raped up to 12 times a day by different men. One of the most shocking details of this case is that the family of Hiroshi were in the house for the entire duration of her ordeal, and Junko was forced to unconvincingly play along as his girlfriend. However, the facade didn't last long. The family members were far too afraid of the Yakuza, or perhaps indifferent to Junko's plight, to do anything about the situation unfolding in front of them. They allowed the abuse and torture of this unknown girl to continue in front of them. They later went on to state that they were too afraid of their own son to do anything about the situation. That being said, one of the men who had been to the house that Junko was held in and had raped her had told his brother about what had happened. The brother went on to report the incident to the police. 2 police officers were subsequently dispatched to the address to investigate the claim. They were informed by family members that there was no teenage girl present in the house, and they were welcome to search the property themselves. Upon hearing this, the officers were satisfied with the offer and believed the invitation alone to search the property was proof enough that there was no teenage girl being held captive. Besides the sexual abuse, there was unimaginable physical abuse that Junko was subjected to. She was beaten daily as a means of entertainment. This involved locking her in a freeze, forcing her to drink large amounts of alcohol, inhale paint thinner, hung upside down and used as a punch bag. Barbells were dropped on her body. Her head was stamped on so much that she could no longer breathe from her nose. Her fingernails were ripped off. Foreign objects were inserted into her. Her eyelids were cut off. Her nipple was cut off. She was burnt with cigarettes and lighters, and she was forced to eat cockroaches and starved. Somewhere during her ordeal, Junko had managed to get her hands on the main house phone where she was being kept. She had got as far as getting through to the emergency operator before she was discovered and the line was disconnected. The emergency operator called back, but Hiroshi convinced the operator that it had been an accident and the matter was closed on their end. For Junko, however, this led to a severe beating and yet more torture. It was during these beatings that Junko pleaded with her captors to end her suffering and kill her. They, however, refused and continued their depraved attack on her. 40 days had now passed, and Junko's small body had become worn down by the abuse. She could barely talk or even walk. Going to the bathroom became such a strenuous task for her that it took over an hour to just get there, and so she remained in her makeshift prison cell at all times, urinating and defecating on herself as she'd become incontinent from the severe abuse. Junko was also unable to eat or drink. Her body could no longer accept food, and she was constantly vomiting up anything she tried to swallow. In addition to this, her face had become so badly swollen she was unrecognisable, and her body began to give off a putrid smell. The group began to lose interest in her at this point and were plotting to dispose of her. It was shortly after this that the group and Junko were playing a game of mahjong, a tile game popular in East Asia. As a testament to Junko's intelligence, even in her worn-down state, she had beaten the men in the game, and in anger, or perhaps revenge, a savage attack was launched. Junko's legs were doused in lighter fluid, and she was set alight. The pain she must have suffered doesn't bear thinking about. Junko tried to put out the fire at first, but the fumes overcame her and she soon became unresponsive. However, this didn't deter the group from attacking her further. She was kicked, punched and beaten. She was burnt and whipped and began to bleed profusely. In order to not get blood on them, they covered their hands with plastic bags and continued their savage attack on Junko. They continued to drop heavy objects onto her body, pour hot wax onto her, and her body began to convulse. The attack lasted for 2 hours, and by the end, Junko had died. Once the group realised that they had finally ended her life, they began to panic and decided to dispose of her body. They wrapped her in a travel bag and placed her body in a large drum and proceeded to pour wet concrete onto it. Much of the fascination around Junko's murder centres around this detail. In fact, a 2004 Japanese film called Concrete was produced, which was based on Junko's ordeal and subsequent murder. Less than 3 weeks after the murder, 2 of the perpetrators were arrested in connection to a separate gang rape of another woman. Once the men were arrested, however, they had mistakenly believed that they had been caught for what had been done to Junko and gave up the location of where the drum containing Junko's body had been hidden. Once the police discovered her remains, they connected the dots and realised that the missing persons report filed 40 days ago was linked to the horrific remains discovered. The group of men was subsequently arrested alongside a number of other men also accused of sexually assaulting the teenager. The identity of the accused was initially not released to the public as they were all under the age of 18. However, a leading Japanese magazine leaked the pictures and names of the accused, stating that they did not deserve anonymity. The group of men were taken to court to have their fate decided by a judge. All 4 of the men accused pleaded guilty to committing bodily injury that resulted in death instead of murder. The ringleader, Hiroshi Miyano, was sentenced to 17 years in prison. This was later increased to 20 upon appeal. Yasushi Watanabe was sentenced to 4 years, later increased to 7 years. Joe Ogara was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and Nobuharu Minato was sentenced to 6 years, later increased to 9 years upon appeal. Junko's family were disappointed at the length of the sentences handed out to the killers and filed a civil lawsuit against Hiroshi Miyano's parents, in whose home the crimes were committed. They were rewarded the equivalent of $370,000. 3 out of the 4 killers, once released, went on to reoffend and commit further crimes that resulted in a serious injury to other people. All 4 are now believed to be living their separate lives in different parts of Japan. Junko's funeral was held in April of 1989, 4 months after her murder. Her future intended employer presented her parents with the uniform she would have worn, and this was placed alongside her in her casket. Her parents were also presented with her high school diploma. She graduated alongside her peers, but tragically was never able to see the day. Junko's murder opens up a larger conversation about crimes, in particular sexually motivated crimes against women, and the struggle to combat a mindset that women are to blame. In fact, after one of the accused was sentenced, Joe Ogara, his mother vandalised Junko's grave, saying that she was responsible for ruining her son's life. That brings us to the end of this case. It was an interesting case to cover, and as I mentioned, it was the first one that's taken us outside of the UK. It's also the oldest case I've covered, and Junko's killers are actually free right now, which is baffling. Before you go, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about what case you'd like me to cover next. Stay safe.